Great. Well, thanks for having me out. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing. I'm going to kind of give some broad strokes because I imagine how many people grew up on a farm in this room? We had one hand go up, 2 hands go up. All right, good. So some people know some things about agriculture, but I figured this was not your domain of expertise. And so I would give you a little bit of a primer and then give some examples of the work that we're doing. And part of what I'm highlighting today is that over the course of the last year, it feels like, well, it's been about a year now, that we've been in a pilot project. It feels a little bit bigger than a pilot now, but in a pilot project with Microsoft and exploring the opportunities how FarmBeats might work within our system, as well as the TV white space. And so I'll talk about those applications after I set some context here. So, we've got a real challenge in agriculture right now. So if those of you are not aware, right, we've got like 9 to 10 billion people that we're going to need to be feeding by 2050. So a huge increase in the population, and that puts a huge demand on how much food we need to produce. But it's not just the story of how much more food that we need to produce to feed the world. It's that we're doing it in the face of all of these destabilizing factors in agriculture right now. So with climate change, we have more droughts, more floods, more extreme weather events, and the frequency of those events. And so that puts a lot of strain on our agriculture, a ton of strain on our production systems just to get things planted and harvested in a timely fashion. The competing water demands between urban consumption and agriculture is another big one. And so that is certainly one that is going to continue to put pressure on us to be more efficient with our water use. And then we have pest management challenges. So for those of probably a lot of folks don't know this, but we're running out of chemical control options to kill our weeds, for example. Right? So many of our weeds are developed resistance to herbicides, just like humans can develop resistance to viruses and such, right? So weeds are developing into resistance to the herbicides we have, but they're not just developing resistance to 1, 2, or 3 chemistries. We have weeds out there now that are resistant to 5 different chemistries. So we're running out of the ability to control weeds in the way that has been the Cadillac method of controlling weeds for the last 60 plus years. It's been every 5 years farmers have been getting new solutions in this paradigm, and so they haven't had to focus on a lot of integrated strategies. And now they're running out of those control options. And further, we've had a long run at declining soil and water quality in our systems. So we don't just have to feed the world. We don't just have to increase the food production to feed those people. We've got to do it in the face of all of these other destabilizing factors. So it's challenging. So some of the things we're looking for in agriculture, what kinds of systems of the future that we want, systems that are resilient to climate, so climate-resilient cropping systems. We need to increase our water and nutrient use efficiency and its availability. We need to improve our soil health. So this is just the vitality of the soil and the biological activity of the soil and the function of the soil, right? We need to increase crop productivity as well as stabilize the yields when we have all these fluctuating climate conditions that we're dealing with, right? When droughts and floods come in, we want to still be able to have production systems that are stable and can deal with that kind of complexity. And there's also a lot of interest in increasing the density of our food systems. So precision agriculture is being seen as one of the ways to get there. Absolutely. We've had a lot of advancements in precision agriculture, just developing more precise solutions in the agricultural landscape, taking into consideration the spatial complexity of our fields, because in an agricultural field, this may look like everything is the same out there, but there's actually quite a bit of noise out in these fields. There's huge variations in soil types across some of these fields, drainage, nutrients. All of those things affect the performance of our systems. So, precision agriculture is focused on how can we dial in various crop populations across these fields or change the fertility rates or our nutrient applications. And that's been an important part of addressing this. But there's also this resiliency factor that we need to stabilize our systems, which is what sustainable agriculture is focused a lot around, right? Which is using practices like cover crops, which are not marketed crops, but they grow in between our cash crops and they provide various different ecosystem services. Reducing tillage has been a primary focus. Developing more complex crop rotations are critical needs. These are all kind of key sustainability strategies in developing more sustainable cropping systems, but they're not being put into a precision framework, and that's part of what we are trying to do, is take these sustainable strategies, make them more precise. Because you can see in a landscape we can have wet spots in a given field, and those wet spots can drive the performance of those plants. So we need to be able to know where that is, be able to understand why that's happening, and be able to develop solutions around that. So, building the complexity, the knowledge that's needed to manage that. So putting all of this climate soil management together, and so that requires not just going out there and doing the sampling, right? It's really laborious. For me to fund, my staff and my technical team to go out into the fields and collect data, it's expensive. People are expensive to pay to run into the fields and collect these samples. Whereas if we can develop a lot of sensing solutions to help us get there, then we can be able to cover a lot more landscape, we can get a lot more information, and we can put that into that spatial context that I was describing. And so these are just some of the different applications we're targeting right here, which is like the high throughput phenotyping, for breeding purposes, plant models to help with decision making, so adaptive decision supports. So all of this goes into this ecosystem of the Internet of Things that are in our farming systems to help with the solving of this challenge. And so we're integrating a suite of different practices to do that, right? So we need computer vision to get there, because we'll be able to see what's in the landscape and be able to label that and be able to replicate that, right? And so we can use computer vision, we can use traditional process-based models, empirical statistics. We can also use hybrid approaches or integrate that with machine learning applications and kind of put that together and apply that towards our cover crops that I mentioned earlier, our cash crop performance, and integrate the kinds of climate and soil conditions that are important too. And so these are just some of the strategies we're using to get to kind of build the decision support platforms we need and kind of address some of these key goals that I mentioned earlier. So how do you do this? You need lots of data. So I'm just going to give you a quick snapshots of examples of that. Here's a national breeding network that I'm working with that we're developing regionally adapted cover crop materials so that we can fit that into our cropping systems. And so this includes public and private sector partnerships around the U.S., collectively working together using all sorts of different sensing solutions to get there. We create these component experiments. So this is just like research stations. These are universities and USDA facilities all partnering. So it's just a single location in each one of these states, right? So that's not capturing a lot of spatial complexity, but it's still giving us an indication of performance across the U.S. and some of our major grain-producing regions. The USDA has also initiated long-term cropping systems experiments across the U.S. So these are 18 key kind of regions throughout the U.S. that represent specific farming systems that we can then collect lots of data over time. So this is getting at the longitudinal aspects of the data we need, but not so much as the space. And so we've built these kind of large on-farm networks over the last couple of years. This is a team that I'm coordinating with that over the last 4 or 5 years, we've gotten to about 140 sites across the U.S., and we're trying to expand that network to about 250 plus farms where we're monitoring the kinds of things that matter, right? Water, nitrogen, wheat, pests, disease, and such. And so the strength of this is building partnerships with public sector partners as well as private sector partners. And so you can see the big circles are research stations, and the dots represent kind of on-farm networks. And so putting all those kinds of players together, you can see there's a big ecosystem of folks working together to build these kinds of solutions. It takes lots of data to drive kind of AI in our systems, and this data is expensive and challenging to come by. And so this kind of all, you see Microsoft in here because we started developing this pilot project with them in the last year to look at some of the data we're collecting from this on-farm network and see how FarmBeats could help facilitate some of that data analysis and aggregation. So here's images of kind of on-farm networks, just visuals to show, the real busy work. We have to go out there with our hands and collect samples and monitor things. Here's real-time water that we're monitoring, the infiltration, availability of water. We're doing deep soil cores, and we're also using drones and various low-cost camera systems to develop the kinds of imaging we need to sense what's on the ground. Because whether it's a crop, whether it's a cover crop, whatever that plant is, we want to know how much of that is out there at the time, at a given time, and we want to know what its quality, its composition, and we want to use kind of sensing solutions to get there. So here's some of the examples from a weed perspective. Using a lot of digital imagery, we can actually detect the difference between a weed and a crop now. And so not just the detection of the weed from the crop, but also this distinction between species. And that's some of the applications that we're using. And here's the example that I wanted to showcase today. I brought this really simple camera. This is just a really inexpensive, cheap camera. This is what they call these Fino cams, right? So you just put them out in the field, they're continuously taking images. And so it's a real simple low-tech solution. For us to monitor water out in the landscape, historically it's been very expensive sensors that you can only install at a single locate point, like estimate right there. And then you can't litter those across the landscape because they're expensive. It's not, maybe on a research station you could do some of that, but on a farm you can't just put water sensors and loggers all across a farm and collect that information because it's very expensive. The equipment that is needed to do that. Even the low-cost solutions we were developing are pretty expensive. So we looked at other low-cost strategies to be able to integrate across the landscape. And so this is just a simple, what we're calling a stress cam. It's continuously taking photos throughout the day. This is just some of the configurations of this stress cam. So this is really just very simple using Raspberry Pi, 8 for cameras. You can see here that we've got a switch to be able to turn this on and off, and we're experimenting with the different angles and the dimensions in which we capture these images. But just with simple images now, we can track over the course of a day. Oh, I can't manipulate it. We're going to have to sit here and wait. Sorry. Oh, well. So over the course of a day, it's just taking images. Well, now soybeans, just like corn, when it gets dry and droughty in the soil, the leaves start to roll. So if we can develop an image recognition system for people to say, okay, here's a soybean that's happy, it's got plenty of water. Oh, look, it's starting to dry down. I think we're getting there. Here we go. No, it's a long video. I normally click through it, but I don't have the ability to do that in this setup. Can you see that starting to go? There we go. Look at it collapsing now. Drought stress is coming on. So now we can train the image recognition to say, okay, from the moment those leaves are curling, we know that drought stress sets in. When those leaves curl back, it's no longer under water stress, and all we need is a simple timestamp to do that, right? So by using kinds of edge systems like what we've been collaborating with FarmBeats, FarmBeats has been giving us the TV white space that creates the connectivity on the farm, and then by the edge processing, we can then not have to move all this image into the cloud, which is expensive and hard to do in large landscapes where we don't have that connectivity. We can do this in the edge. We can process that. All we're now shooting up into the cloud is just simple timestamps of when the leaf curled and when it leaf curled back, and that's an indicator of drought stress. These are super cheap, under $50. We can start to integrate these across broad landscapes and collect lots of information. So I think I'm already probably over time. So I just had one slide left, which was just that all of this then gets integrated into various different decision support tools. So when we want to work with farmers and inform them and help them with their decision-making process, we want to be able to integrate all of this data into a usable format. So it helps first and foremost inform the researchers, to ask the what-if questions. So if we improve some practice in the Mid-Atlantic region by 10%, how much nutrients are we reducing loading going into the Chesapeake Bay? Or how much is that going to improve the habitat in the Chesapeake Bay? So we can ask the what-if questions in these kinds of systems, but then we directly are either interacting with the farmers or through the typical technology transfer approaches where their consultants are working with the farmers to help them use these tools, and then these tools that we're developing from these kind of data sets also inform policy-making decisions around when they're making cost-share programs to help farmers out. They need to know what drives performance, and they need that kind of data to inform that. And so our types of tools help inform that. So thank you.